The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the sprawling greenery of Central Park, its rays stretching lazily over the well-trodden paths and the gnarled trunks of towering elms. The air, crisp with the lingering chill of autumn, carried the mingled sense of damp earth and distant food carts hawking roasted chestnuts. Children's laughter rippled through the air, punctuated by the distant barking of dogs and the occasional hum of a passing cyclist. Donald Trump walked at an unhurried pace, his overcoat buttoned against the breeze. He had come alone today, no motorcade, no hovering security detail, just a quiet moment to himself, away from the weight of expectations. The past years have been a storm of headlines and heated debates, but here, among the rustling leaves and the rhythmic chatter of joggers, the world felt momentarily simple. As he strolled past the stone bridges and winding paths, his gaze swept over the familiar sights of the park. Families gathered on picnic blankets, old men played chess under the wooden gazebo, and artists hunched over sketchbooks, capturing fleeting moments in soft charcoal strokes. But then, something else caught his attention. On a weathered wooden bench near the fountain sat a man, his figure hunched, his hands clasped between his knees. His clothes, though not tattered, bore the unmistakable signs of long wear. The frayed edges of his sleeves, the smudges of dirt along his jeans. His boots, scuffed and unevenly laced, told a story of long walks and colder nights. Trump had seen many like him before, men who had once carried purpose in their eyes, now dulled by years of hardship. He knew this look well. A soldier, perhaps, a worker left behind, someone who had given much and received little in return. Something about the man's posture, the quiet defeat in his shoulders, made Trump pause. For a moment, he considered walking past. A million problems demanded his attention elsewhere, pressing matters that required urgent decisions. But something deeper than politics or duty urged him to stop. He took a few steps closer. The man barely stirred, his gaze fixed on the ground before him, as if lost in the weight of a thought too heavy to lift. A few passers-by glanced at him, their expressions fleetingly sympathetic before they hurried along, unwilling or unable to linger in the presence of misfortune. Trump watched. He had seen this before. The invisibility of struggle, the way society averted its eyes from the uncomfortable truth of suffering. And then, as if sensing the scrutiny, the man lifted his head. Their eyes met. It was then that Trump saw the truth written in the lines of the man's face, the quiet ache in his weary blue eyes. He wasn't just another nameless figure in the park. He had a story, one etched into the tired slope of his shoulders, the slight tremor in his hands. A gust of wind rustled the nearby trees, sending a scatter of leaves spiraling onto the pavement. Trump took a slow breath, then stepped forward, lowering himself onto the bench beside the man. The man tensed, as if expecting to be shooed away, but when no words of dismissal came, he glanced sideways, his expression a mixture of curiosity and wariness. Trump didn't speak right away. Instead, he simply sat, listening to the quiet rustle of the park, allowing the moment to settle between them. It was an unusual silence, one that carried an unspoken weight, an acknowledgement that no words could erase whatever had brought the man to this bench. A moment stretched into another, and then the man exhaled a slow and heavy breath, as if releasing something he had carried for far too long. And in that instant, Trump knew he had made the right choice by stopping. He was about to hear a story that would change everything. The wind stirred the fallen leaves at their feet, carrying with it the crisp scent of autumn. A few joggers passed by, their rhythmic footfalls fading into the distance, but Trump hardly noticed. His focus remained on the man beside him, the quiet yet palpable sorrow radiating from his slumped shoulders. For a long moment, the man seemed hesitant, almost as if he was deciding whether to speak at all. His fingers fidgeted slightly, rubbing at the callous skin of his knuckles, his hands worn from years of labor or war. Then, as if surrendering to an unspoken force, he let out a heavy sigh. "I wasn't always like this," he murmured, his voice rough with fatigue. His gaze remained fixed ahead, as if the memories forming in his mind were too vivid to allow him to look anywhere else. You see a man on a bench, a drifter, someone forgotten. But I had a name once, a purpose. I had a home. Trump remained silent, knowing that sometimes the weight of a story needed room to be spoken aloud before it could be understood. The man swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing slightly as he forced himself to continue. I served, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. 15 years in the Army. 3 deployments. Afghanistan, Iraq. I was a sergeant, led my team into places most people would never dare to imagine. I lost brothers out there. Good men. The kind of men who should have come home, but didn't. His fingers curled into fists, the tremor in his hands becoming more pronounced. When I finally did come back, nothing felt the same. The world had moved on without me. I had a wife, a little girl. I thought they'd be waiting for me like in the movies, like in those stories they tell you, when they want you to believe everything works out in the end. But life doesn't pause just because you're gone. People change. Love fades. And the man they sent back home wasn't the man they had kissed goodbye. His breath hitched slightly, but he steadied himself before allowing emotion to take over. She tried, he admitted, his voice laced with an old grief. My wife. She really did. But how do you live with a man who wakes up screaming? Who flinches at loud noises? Who stares out the window for hours, waiting for threats that don't exist anymore? Trump listened intently, his face unreadable, but his posture had shifted ever so slightly. An imperceptible lean forward, a quiet acknowledgement of the weight behind the words. She left. The man continued, his voice now resigned rather than bitter. Took my little girl and started over somewhere new. I didn't blame her. I couldn't. I was a ghost in my own home, and no one wants to live with a ghost. The leaves rustled around them, a gentle whisper of nature against the harsh truths being laid bare. I tried, he said, shaking his head. I really did. I looked for work. Factory jobs, construction, anything that would keep my hands busy so my mind wouldn't wander. But companies don't exactly line up to hire a guy with PTSD. I could fake normal for a while, but the cracks always showed eventually. And when the nightmares got worse, when the panic attacks became too frequent, I started drinking to quiet them down. A bitter chuckle escaped him. It worked for a while, until it didn't. Lost the job, lost the apartment, and before I even knew what was happening, I ended up here. He gestured vaguely to the park around them, his hand coming to rest on the rough wood of the bench. Another nameless face in the crowd. Just another veteran whose war didn't end when he left the battlefield. Silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Trump exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the cool air. His fingers drummed against his knee, a thoughtful rhythm, but still he said nothing. The man beside him, perhaps expecting the usual platitudes. That's tough, man. Life's unfair. Hope things turn around. Shifted uncomfortably, preparing for the moment he would be left alone again. But Trump didn't move. Instead, after a long pause, he asked, "What was her name?" The man blinked, caught off guard. My wife." Trump nodded. For a moment, the man hesitated. Then, as if unearthing something long buried, he answered, "Claire. And my daughter, her name is Emily." His voice faltered slightly at the mention of his child, the syllables wrapped in equal parts longing and regret. Trump nodded again, as if locking those names into memory. Another pause. Then, with a deep breath, he leaned back against the bench, his gaze drifting across the park. "You know," Trump said finally, his voice thoughtful, "there's something about this country that's always bothered me. We send men like you off to fight wars. Wars that most people will only ever read about in history books or see in movies. We drape flags over caskets. We hold parades. We put on a big show about patriotism. But then we forget. We let those same men come back to nothing. To empty apartments. To rejection letters. To silence." The man turned slightly, eyes narrowing as he took in the unexpected depth behind Trump's words. Trump exhaled, rubbing his chin. And then, when they slip through the cracks, we pretend it's their fault. We blame them for not adjusting fast enough, for not being strong enough to push through. But tell me, how is a man supposed to fight a battle he was never trained for? How do you heal from wounds no one can see? The man swallowed hard, his fingers gripping his own knees. No one really asks that, Trump continued, because no one wants to hear the answer. It's easier to look away. A long pause followed, the wind stirring the trees once more. And then Trump did something unexpected. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat, pulling out a small, crisp notepad and a pen. He flipped to a fresh page, scribbled something quickly, then tore it free. Folding the note once, he held it out. The man hesitated before taking it, his fingers ghosting over the edges of the paper. He didn't unfold it right away. Instead, he looked up, searching Trump's face for some indication of what this was. Trump's expression remained unreadable, but his voice carried a quiet certainty. "Tomorrow," he said, "you start over." The man blinked. "I what?" Trump rose from the bench, adjusting his coat. "Just be ready." With that, he turned, his stride steady as he walked away, disappearing into the throng of parkgoers. The man sat in stunned silence for a moment, the slip of paper still pressed between his fingers. Then, with a slow inhale, he unfolded it. His breath hitched. There, in clear and precise handwriting, was an address. And beneath it, a simple instruction: "Come at 9 a.m. No excuses." The man stared at the note, his heart pounding. He didn't know it yet, but this was the moment his life would change forever. The night was restless. Sleep didn't come easily, not when the weight of possibility sat heavily on his chest. The slip of paper remained clenched in his fingers, as if letting go of it might somehow erase the moment, might return him to the familiar solitude of a park bench and a life measured in surviving, not living. The address stared back at him, unwavering, its promise both hopeful and terrifying. "Come at 9 a.m. No excuses. No excuses." For a long time, excuses have been the only thing keeping him afloat. "I can't because I have nothing left. I won't because I'll only fail again. I shouldn't because no one really cares what happens to me anymore." But now, for the first time in years, someone had given him a direction. Not pity, not an empty promise. A real direction. So as the first rays of morning light broke through the skeletal branches above him, he stood, and he walked. The address led him to a building he hadn't expected. It wasn't a homeless shelter. It wasn't a charity office. It wasn't a place where broken men were handed secondhand clothes and told, "Good luck." No, this was different. A brick structure stood proudly before him, its windows reflecting the pale morning sun. The glass doors gleamed, bearing a plaque with gold lettering that read, "Veterans Business Initiative, rebuilding those who built this nation." He hesitated at the entrance, shifting uncomfortably in his worn boots. He hadn't walked into a place like this in years, a place where people had expectations, where people would look at him and expect him to be something more than a man who barely had the strength to get through the day. Would they see him for what he was? A failure? A shadow of the soldier he had once been? He nearly turned back. But then he remembered the look in Trump's eyes the day before. Not just determination, but expectation. "Tomorrow, you start over." He took a deep breath, pushed open the door, and stepped inside. The receptionist barely looked up before greeting him. "Mr. Callahan." The name startled him. He hadn't heard it spoken with that much certainty in years. "Ah, yeah, that's me." She nodded, as if she had expected him. "Right this way." She led him down a hallway, past framed photographs of men and women in uniform, past conference rooms filled with quiet conversations. The air here wasn't sterile or cold, like in government offices where people spoke in rehearsed sympathy. It was warm, alive with purpose. At the end of the hall, a door stood ajar. Inside, a man in a crisp suit stood with his back to the room, glancing out the window at the street below. And then, as if sensing the arrival, he turned. "Trump, you came," Trump said, his voice even. Callahan shifted on his feet, clearing his throat. "Yeah." Trump studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Good." He gestured toward a chair across from him. "Sit." Callahan obeyed, though his body remained stiff, uncertain. For a moment, Trump said nothing, merely flipping through a folder on his desk. Then he spoke. "I made some calls last night." Callahan tensed. He had heard those words before, but in a different setting. Back when calls meant background checks, meant polite rejections, meant another door closing in his face. Trump continued, told them I had a good man looking for work, told them he was someone worth investing in. Callahan blinked, barely processing the words. I want to be clear about something, Trump went on, setting the folder down. I don't believe in handouts. Never have. But I believe in giving people the tools to help themselves. Callahan swallowed, his throat tight. This place, Trump gestured around them, isn't about charity. It's about rebuilding. Veterans like you come in, they train, they learn how to run businesses, how to manage money, how to take control of their own futures. Callahan frowned slightly. But I don't know anything about that kind of stuff. Trump smirked. Neither did I once. But you learn. A beat of silence. Then Trump leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the desk. I want you to stay here. Train. Get your bearings. And in a few months, if you're willing to work, we'll get you started on something real. Callahan's heart pounded against his ribs. What kind of work? Trump's lips twitched into something that was almost a smile. That depends. What do you want to build? Hours passed in a blur. Callahan met with other veterans, men and women who had been where he was, who had sat in the same chair and wondered if they were worth the effort. He listened as they spoke of second chances, of businesses they had started, of families they had rebuilt. For the first time in years, he saw a path forward. But it wasn't just about him anymore. At one point, as he sat by a window with a fresh cup of coffee, his first in a long time that hadn't come from a gas station, Trump approached again, his hands tucked in his pockets. There's one more thing. Callahan looked up. Trump handed him a slip of paper. A phone number. She's in Boston now, Trump said simply. Your daughter. The air in Callahan's lungs vanished. Al, how did you? Trump shrugged. You told me her name. That was enough. Callahan stared at the number, his fingers trembling. You don't have to call today, Trump said, his tone softer now. You don't have to call tomorrow. But when you're ready, when you believe you're the man she deserves, dial it. Callahan pressed the paper to his chest, gripping it as if it might slip away. He couldn't speak, couldn't find the words. Trump, as if sensing this, merely clapped him on the shoulder. Welcome back, soldier. And with that, he walked away, leaving Callahan alone in the quiet sunlight of the room. For the first time in years, Callahan felt something new. Hope. The following weeks moved in a way Callahan hadn't experienced in years. Not in slow, dragging time, not in endless nights filled with nothing but regrets and cold pavement, but in motion. Purpose. A reason to wake up in the morning that had nothing to do with mere survival. It wasn't easy. Rebuilding never is. The Veterans Business Initiative wasn't some handout where people nodded sympathetically and told you what you wanted to hear. No, it was a place where men and women who had seen the worst of the world were given the tools to fight their way back. Not with weapons, but with knowledge, with discipline, with a chance. Each morning, Callahan woke up in the small but clean apartment they had arranged for him. Nothing fancy, just four walls, a bed, and a door that locked, a luxury he hadn't had in years. It was strange at first, sleeping under a roof that didn't belong to a shelter, waking up without the immediate need to check whether his few possessions had been stolen in the night. But it was real, and with each day, he began to believe in it. The classes were intense: business fundamentals, financial management, leadership training. For a man who had once led soldiers in a battle, the idea of managing numbers and balance sheets seemed foreign at first, but he forced himself to learn. And then there were the therapy sessions, optional but encouraged. Callahan had never been one to talk about feelings, never been one to sit in a room and discuss nightmares with strangers. But when he saw other men who had once been like him, broken, lost, sitting in those chairs and finding ways to put the past behind them, he thought, maybe it was time. And so, hesitantly at first, he joined them. The first time he spoke about the war, about the nights when his mind still placed him back in the desert, he had expected judgment. Instead, he found understanding. He found men who nodded, who knew, who had walked through the same fire and lived with the same ghosts. And slowly, piece by piece, the weight on his shoulders became lighter. But there was still one thing left. The folded piece of paper sat untouched on his nightstand, its edges worn from the number of times he had picked it up and placed it back down. His daughter's phone number. Emily. She was 11 now. He had missed so much. First steps, first words, birthdays, scraped knees, bedtime stories. He had convinced himself for years that she was better off without him, that the man he had become had no right to return into her world. But that was changing. For the first time, he had something to show for himself. Not just a promise to do better, but proof that he was doing it. And so, one evening, with the city lights blinking outside his window, he sat on the edge of his bed, picked up the phone, and dialed. The line rang. Once, twice. Then a voice answered. It wasn't Emily's. It was Claire's. Hello. The sound of her voice sent a jolt through his chest. How long had it been? Years. Too many. He cleared his throat, his grip tightening on the phone. Claire, it's me. A long silence followed. He could picture her now, her fingers tightening around the phone, her breath caught between recognition and disbelief. Then cautiously she asked, Michael, his name. He had almost forgotten what it was like to hear it spoken by someone who had once loved him. Yeah, he said, his voice hoarse. It's me. Another silence. But this time, it wasn't empty. It was filled with unspoken things, with questions, with memories, with pain. Finally, Claire exhaled. I never thought I'd hear from you again, she admitted. He swallowed the lump in his throat. I didn't think you'd want to. I didn't, she said bluntly. Not for a long time. He nodded, even though she couldn't see him. I get that. Another pause. Then more softly she asked, why now? He ran a hand through his hair, staring at the floor. Because for the first time, I have something to say that isn't an apology. I mean, I'm sorry, Claire, for everything. But I'm not calling to ask for forgiveness. He took a breath. I just want to know if Emily's okay. Claire hesitated, but then she sighed. She's okay. His shoulders sagged in relief. She's strong. She's smart. She loves reading, fantasy books, mostly. She started playing soccer last year. She's got my stubborn streak, but sometimes when she talks, I hear you in her voice. The words struck something deep in him. She doesn't remember much, Claire continued, her voice quieter now. But she asks about you. His breath caught. She does. Claire hesitated. I didn't know what to tell her, Mike. I couldn't lie, but I didn't want to tell her you were gone for good, either. So I told her you were lost, but that I hoped one day you'd find your way back. His eyes burned. He squeezed them shut. Am I too late? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Another pause. Then Claire said something he hadn't expected. I don't know, she admitted. But if you're serious, if this isn't just another false start, maybe. It wasn't a promise. It wasn't an open door, but it was something. And for now, that was enough. They spoke for a little longer. Nothing deep, nothing overwhelming. Just small steps. Before they hung up, Claire said, I'll think about it. About letting her talk to you. That was all he needed to hear. When he placed the phone back on the nightstand, his hands were trembling, but not with fear. With hope. For the first time in years, he wasn't just drifting. He was climbing back up, and he wasn't going to stop now. The sun began its slow ascent over the city skyline, casting golden hues across the rooftops and streets that were still stretching awake. A thin layer of frost clung to the sidewalks, shimmering in the light, a quiet reminder of the season's grip upon the world. Standing outside the Veterans Business Initiative building, Callahan inhaled the crisp morning air, steadying himself against the overwhelming tide of thoughts racing through his mind. Today was not just another day spent in quiet contemplation, another morning lost in the echoes of regret and hesitation. Today was different, because today was the day he would finally step forward into a future he had long believed was lost. For weeks, he had trained with men and women who, like him, had once lived on the edge of despair, unsure whether they were still worthy of something greater. He had learned skills he never thought he would need, had sat in rooms filled with voices that understood his burdens, had rebuilt pieces of himself that he had once discarded. Now, after everything, the sleepless nights, the aching uncertainty, the endless cycle of self-doubt, he had been given an opportunity that could alter the course of his life forever. He was no longer a man simply surviving from one day to the next, waiting for something to change. He was here, standing at the threshold of possibility, and he was ready to walk through it. The door before him, made of smooth glass and polished steel, reflected his own image back at him, yet it no longer felt like a stranger's face. The clean-shaven jaw, the crisp collar of his newly pressed shirt, the firm set of his shoulders, all of it felt unfamiliar, yet deeply right, as though he had finally returned to the version of himself that had been buried beneath years of hardship. He had been given this suit, given these polished shoes, given a second chance, but no one had handed him the determination to stand here today. That had been his own doing, a slow and painful process of reclaiming the dignity he had let slip through his fingers like sand. For a moment, his hands trembled slightly at his sides, a ghost of the past reminding him of the uncertainty that had plagued him for so long. But then, just as doubt threatened to coil itself around his resolve, a presence made itself known beside him, shifting the weight of the moment in an unexpected way. He did not need to turn his head to recognize the figure standing there, his presence too distinct to mistake for anyone else. The weight of experience, of scrutiny, of conviction radiated from the man who had set this entire journey into motion, the man who had chosen to see him when no one else had. There was no need for words, no need for affirmations or explanations, because everything that needed to be understood already existed between them. A simple nod, an almost imperceptible glance, an acknowledgement of a choice made and a challenge accepted. These small gestures carried more weight than any speech could convey. The moment stretched between them, heavy with the quiet understanding that every path forward was built upon a single decision to rise. And then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, the man turned away, his presence fading into the movement of the world around them. Left standing alone once more, Callahan exhaled slowly, feeling the last remnants of hesitation dissolve into the cold morning air. With measured steps, he moved toward the entrance, pushing through the glass doors that marked the transition from everything he had been into everything he had yet to become. The interview room awaited him, an unassuming space filled with the scent of fresh coffee and quiet anticipation, a setting that would determine whether his efforts had been enough. The desk before him bore the weight of paperwork and neatly stacked folders, while the chair across from him held the presence of a man evaluating his future. The questions came quickly, each one carefully designed to assess whether he was capable, whether he was prepared, whether he was truly ready to step into the world of responsibility once more. He answered with confidence that surprised even himself, drawing not from rehearsed responses, but from the deeply ingrained lessons of survival, leadership, and perseverance. He spoke of his years in the military, of the strategies he had once used on the battlefield, of the resilience he had learned through hardship, of the discipline that had carried him through the darkest moments of his life. He did not embellish, did not seek pity, did not lean on the crutch of sympathy. Instead, he presented himself as what he was, a man who had faced the worst and had chosen to fight his way back. As the final question settled into the air between them, a silence followed, stretching just long enough for doubt to whisper its presence at the edges of his mind. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the man across from him reached out, extending a firm handshake that spoke of recognition, of trust, of an opportunity granted. The weight of that moment pressed against Callahan's chest, a tangible proof that everything he had endured had led him to this very point. He had earned this, not through luck, not through charity, but through sheer will. The walk outside felt different this time, the pavement beneath his feet more solid, the air around him filled with a new kind of clarity. The letter in his hand, the one confirming his new employment, felt heavier than it should have, its presence carrying more than just an offer. It carried proof of a future once thought unreachable. But even as the certainty of this step settled into his bones, he knew there was still another journey left to make, one far more daunting than any interview or training session could ever be. The slip of paper he had avoided for weeks still sat in his pocket, its edges creased from the number of times he had taken it out, only to fold it away again. It bore the phone number that had once been just a distant dream, the connection to a life he had let slip through his fingers, the last fragile tie to a daughter who had grown up without him. As his fingers traced the inked numbers, his heart pounded against his ribs, a deep and resounding reminder of what was at stake. The first ring felt like a lifetime, the second an eternity, and by the third he nearly convinced himself that it was a mistake. Then, just as the thought took hold, the line connected, and the softest voice, one he had almost forgotten but had never truly let go of, reached across the distance between them. It was a voice laced with hesitation, with uncertainty, with a fragile hope that neither of them knew how to hold. There was no anger, no resentment, no immediate rejection, only the weight of a question left unspoken, a question that carried years of longing and unanswered prayers. In that moment, standing beneath the vast and endless sky, he felt something shift deep within him, something unbreakable, something real. He knew this was only the beginning, that trust was not granted in an instant, that love was something rebuilt brick by brick. But for the first time, he knew that he was worthy of trying, that he had the strength to stand tall, that he had finally risen from the ashes of the man he used to be. As the call continued, as time unfolded in soft, hesitant steps, the past did not vanish, nor did the regrets that had shaped him. But in the quiet hum of conversation, in the gentle breath of possibility on the other end of the line, he understood that the future was no longer something to fear. It was something to embrace, something to build, something that, no matter how fragile, was now entirely within his grasp. And with that realization, Callahan took his first true step forward, not as a man broken by the past, but as a man who had chosen to rise.